All right. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the MiDA Advisors and Standard Bank educational webinar series titled Africa Matters, Unpacking the Rich Potential of African Investments. My name is Tobile Finga. I am the program manager of the African Women Impact Fund, a project that seeks to develop African women as fund managers across the continent and showcase women as a driving force behind Africa's economic development. Now, despite the investment opportunities available on the continent, global investors often face challenges in identifying clear entry points, navigating the risks, and structuring investments effectively. Building on previous webinars, today's session will provide essential insights for both investors and fund managers who are looking to capitalize on Africa's emerging growth. This session will feature key ecosystem players who will be providing practical guidelines into designing institutional quality fund programs, navigating real-world experiences, and effective strategies to build lasting investor trust. It is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Joining us, we have Elena Haber, who is the 2X Ignite lead at 2X Global. We also have Ali Jalum, who is Head of Business Development at Standard Bank International Fiduciary Services, and Dr. Ola Brown, General Partner at HealthCap Africa. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that this is an educational webinar, and we will also try and leave some room at the end of the session for any questions the audience may have, which you are welcome to post in the Q&A box provided at the bottom. To kick us off with the session, I would first like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their organizations and the role that each of you play within the fund manager's ecosystem. Elena, if I can ask for you to start with the introductions. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much, Tobile, and thank you very much for having me here with you today. So firstly, my name is Elena Haba. I am the 2X Ignite lead at 2X Global. And what 2X Global does essentially is that we focus on getting more capital into the hands of women at scale. And what this means is that we support organizations to invest with a gender lens, and we've been able to mobilize over $33 billion towards this goal in the past few years. We also have an investment and market building arm, which is what 2X Ignite is. And our purpose is to lift the barriers that exist for female fund managers globally. And on the African continent specifically, we run an investment facility where we focus on financing female fund managers. And our goal essentially is to be able to support these female fund managers that are launching their first funds with the investment capital they need to make their first investments and build the track record that they need in order to gain, credibility with investors on the market and just further attract capital into their funds and successfully reach their first close. And in this process, we have a community of over 100 gender-smart emerging managers that we're supporting through different vehicles, but essentially we support them on discussions around structure, around strategy, around fundraising. So all different topics that I'm sure we'll be able to explore more in detail today. And again, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ola, if I can hand over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Ola Brown, and I'm the General Partner at HealthCap Africa. HealthCap Africa is a specialist fund that focuses on investments in early stage fintech and health tech across Africa. In terms of impact, already through our warehouse portfolio, we create 1,000 jobs in 10 countries, serving 2 million patients. And one thing that I'm really proud of is half of our founders are women.
Excellent. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Tobile, and thank you for the opportunity. I represent the fiduciary business of Standard Bank Offshore. As a business, we are based in Jersey and Mauritius. Now, being part of the Big Blue, we work with a number of ecosystems within the bank, be it commercial banking, corporate and investment banking, and other large corporate segments, even debt solutions team. So what we try to do is workshop with these clients and try to understand their problem statements. Thereafter, we work collectively to come up with a value proposition so that we can address these problem statements and create some sort of benefits, be it banking or fiduciary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I'm excited to get into the nitty-gritties of the jurisdictions and fund structures that are available to investors. But before we get into that, Dr. Ola, could you paint a picture of what exactly those investment opportunities that HealthCap is going after by sharing more about your investment philosophy and the investments that you've made?
So we're a venture capital fund, which is a distinct type of private equity. It means that we don't lend money like a typical bank. So we don't lend for interest. We actually acquire shares in companies. But unlike a public market funds that acquire shares in companies that are publicly listed, we work in the private markets and we acquire shares in private companies that have not yet listed. And to be even more specific about venture capital, we actually acquire shares in technology companies, so fast-growing technology companies at their earliest stages. So we play in the pre-Series A space, which is an early-stage investor in fast-growing technology companies. And why is this exciting? Why is this important? If you look at the American Stock Exchange today, nearly 50% of stock market capitalization in the US is technology companies. And if you look back to, like, say, the 1970s, late 1970s, 1980s, then if you remember or recall, Japan, Europe, America actually had roughly the same levels of innovation. But then the US was able to innovate around financing with venture capital. And now when you think about the center of innovation in the world, you think about America, because America has really doubled down on this asset class through Silicon Valley and has created the names and brands that we all know, like Airbnb, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Apple, and all of these are venture capital funded companies. So if we really as Africans want to be part of the future, then we need to be investing in technology and early stage technology. And luckily for us in Africa, we're quite good at building technology companies. So this is the space that we play in. This is the potential in terms of market capitalization and innovation leadership that the venture capital asset class presents.
Amazing. And I mean, talking about how then an investor can access these innovative opportunities and be part of Africa's future, Ali, what are some of the significant jurisdictions for African investment vehicles, and what are some of the things that one needs to bear in mind when considering an appropriate regulatory environment?
Thanks, Tabile. I think choosing the right jurisdiction is very important. Otherwise, it comes back to bite you. And if you look at, let's say, the Global Financial Services Index, there are some 119 financial centers out there, and they all have some sort of ecosystem to attract fund managers globally. Now, Mauritius, for example, is positioned, let's say, fourth regionally, just after Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Morocco. Now, as a fund manager, you can't just pick a jurisdiction from that list and then you decide to set up your fund. I think it's important to do your homework. And there are different factors you need to look at, such as your fund goals, your investor base, and the professional infrastructure you're going to need in that jurisdiction. And let me break it down for you with a few examples. Under the fund goals, whether you're targeting East Africa, West or Southern and Central, I think it's worth to check whether the jurisdiction you want to set up your fund or vehicle has bilateral agreements with these targeted countries. And by bilateral agreements, I mean double taxation avoidance agreements, which help to minimize tax leakages and maximize net investor returns. Likewise, you may want to check if there are investment promotion and protection agreements in place, because these treaties actually help to protect investors' interest or the fund manager's interest against expropriation of assets unfairly. And if in case there are contentious situations, then there are dispute resolution mechanisms in place. Now, again, under the fund goals, I think it's also important to understand what kind of strategy you're running. If you're running a multi-fund strategy, then if the jurisdiction is offering, let's say, a license like the variable capital company, the VCC, that could be a huge plus. The reason I say this is because it's a very flexible platform allowing you to create multiple sub-funds, different styling with legal segregation. And that is important because it helps you to manage your different investment styles. And again, if you are into digital asset classes, then it could be interesting to see, let's say, a virtual asset service provider license or a clear digital framework being offered by that jurisdiction. It shows that the regulator is conscious and aware of the space you're operating in. Now, that's about your fund goals. And of course, there are many more factors to consider under the goals. Another important factor, which I think merits consideration, is your investor base. Now, it's important to check whether your LPs, your investors, such as DFIs, institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, family offices, or high net worth individuals, they are familiar and comfortable with the jurisdiction. Mauritius, for example, has been home to a number of DFIs over the past decades, such as IFC, AFDB, and the Swed Fund. Now, this long-standing presence demonstrates that they have trust and confidence in the regulatory environment surrounding AML, CFT, and tax transparency. And my last point, which I would like fund managers to consider, is very important. Sometimes it is overlooked. It is the professional infrastructure, and that is needed to support your fund's day-to-day operations. By professional infrastructure, I'm alluding to professionals like banks, custodians, legal advisors, tax advisors, fiduciary partners, or fund administrators. You need people who have the depth of experience and also who are familiar with cross-border transactions. A simple example would be if you set up in a jurisdiction where banks are not comfortable with Africa-focused funds, then you may find yourself bogged down or your transactions delayed or blocked because the banks do not have the architecture to manage regional risks. So these are very important things to consider. To summarize, I would say it's important to do the homework because there are so many jurisdictions out there. So check your fund goals, check where your investors are based, where are you raising capital, and whether you have that ecosystem of professional advisors.
Thank you, Ali, for that very comprehensive answer. And I hope at the end you will share where people can actually access this information in case people are not holding a pen and paper at the moment. Ilana, sticking to the homework that emerging fund managers need to do and beyond jurisdictions, there are considerations around best practices around when it comes to fund structuring in the African context. In your experience, what other homework do fund managers need to do around the first boxes that they need to take in their funds journey?
Thank you so much, Tobile. I think I'm going to use some of the language that Ali used, which was to do your homework. One of the things that we always recommend to the fund managers that are part of our community is to, in the same way that they ask the entrepreneurs that they finance whether they have a product market fit, to look at themselves and the product that they want to put on the market, and to understand whether they also have a product market fit, not only for their entrepreneurs, but also the investors that they are trying to solicit. So it's really important when you are setting up your fund to really understand who will be interested by your investment strategy and who would want to finance you with this specific investment strategy, because it is, it's really good for you, of course, to be informed and to be prepared around the jurisdiction and structure and so on, but you can only commit to those things once you really understand who your LP and investor base is. And so what we've unfortunately seen a lot of emerging fund managers make as a mistake is that they want to be extra ready, if I can put it that way, and they're going to rush into incorporation, and they're going to spend a lot of money on legal fees, but ultimately in exploring more and getting into conversations with their potential LP base, they realize that they may have chosen a jurisdiction that's not going to be as appealing for their potential investors, or they're going to choose a structure or a vehicle that is not going to be so friendly for their investors. And so, Ali was mentioning the different categories of investors that you would be able to attract in your fund. If you are actually looking to have perhaps high net worth individuals that are looking to take the money out of the structure that you're proposing quicker than a 10-year period, then maybe what you can consider is something like an SPV structure, and don't have to go through the same kind of legal, dynamics that is required for you to create a fund. And the same legal costs, that it would take to create a fund. And sometimes, going through an SPV structure can be a nice way for you to have a smaller pool of capital that you're managing in order to create the track record that's needed to eventually be able to manage bigger pools of capital and gain the confidence of institutional investors. If you are indeed targeting institutional investors, they're going to have a very clear idea of the type of structures that they are allowed to invest in. If you're targeting DFIs, for example, there's very few of them that are going to be open to evergreen structures, and they're going to want to see a limited life fund. And then these DFIs are, run by their own policies that are influenced by politics as well. So you must be aware, of the countries that they are comfortable investing in. Where can you be incorporated if you want to attract financing from specific DFIs? So you really must do your homework before you move ahead and incorporate and choose a jurisdiction. And part of it is this market research and having conversations with the investors that could be attracted by your investment strategy to really understand what flexibility they have in terms of where they can invest in, what sizes they're comfortable investing in. And of course, as Ali mentioned, if your fund economics are smaller, then you may not want to go towards a jurisdiction that's going to be very costly and burning through, your fund, budget quite quickly. So I think these are all really important considerations. Know your investment strategy, know your fund size, know the LP base that you're targeting, and then you're going to be able to make the decisions around this. And I see Ola coming on camera, so I'm wondering if she has some lived experience that she's going to want to share on this.
Sure, but before we get to Dr. Ola, I think we can, if Ali, you have anything else you add. We were speaking around the money that fund managers end up spending on legal fees. And I mean, that's a critical step in launching a fund, is selecting a proper legal structure. So anything you want to add to that? Why is that, and what are the different structures that are available?
Yeah, I think Elena has really tackled this, and actually deciding the legal structure is probably the most critical step when you launch a vehicle. I wouldn't say a fund, because the fund is one of the structures you can use. So let's call it a vehicle which you are going to use to channel your investments. And it is key, or like I said, it's the most important, because it sets the tone for everything else. How your vehicle is going to be operated, what would be the compliance framework, what would be the operational and administration framework, and regulatory or legal framework, right? So I think the right structure depends on what the fund manager wants to achieve. And I will give a few examples just to break it down. I'm sure many of our participants here, or even our panelists, they understand the GP-LP structure, the general partner limited partner structure. It is very classic, but yet popular structure. Now, one of the main reasons for fund managers or investors to use the GP-LP structure is because of the tax transparency. And as a pass-through vehicle, what happens is that your vehicle does not get taxed in the jurisdiction it is set up. Rather, the taxing rights are in the home country of the limited partners or the investors. And why it is very interesting sometimes is because in their home countries, these investors could be treated as exempt, tax exempt, and that could be a massive attraction. Now, another structure, and I talked about it earlier on, it's the VCC. Sometimes you may not need a limited company, limited liability company, or perhaps just a typical corporate structure we've seen for closed-end funds or private equity structures before. So people would be looking at the variable capital company, especially if you are a fund manager who is running multiple strategies, and that VCC allows you to create sub-funds with different styles, with different strategies. If your investment horizon is different, your investors' risk profiles are different. So that kind of vehicle would help you actually to manage your AUMs. And Elena has also mentioned about the SPV, and I always use the analogy that not everyone needs a G-Wagon of a fund structure. Sometimes a Mini can do the job. So what is important to know is, if, let's say, you have an anchor investor and possibly one or two LPs, and you only have one investment opportunity in mind, then you don't need to set up like a huge fund structure, which sometimes could be costly, and the reporting framework is different, the compliance burden is different, or let me not use the word burden, but the compliance responsibilities are different. Then you might just set up an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, or a simple investment holding company. What happens is you need to look at the regulations in the country you're planning to set up your fund. And some countries, or most of the countries, would tell you that if you are operating on the principle of risk diversification, as in having different portfolio companies, and if you're pooling funds from third parties, then these are indicators for you to go down the route of a fund. But if you only have, like I said, one anchor investor or one LP and one opportunity investment, then just a simple SPV. But what is interesting is, in most of the jurisdictions, especially in Mauritius, you could start as an SPV and then you evolve into a fund. So you always begin with the end in mind. You have a roadmap. You start with something simple. You contain cost. You contain your obligations, and then you thrive based on your investment and investors.
Thank you for that. And bringing it to a more practical level, and on how this actually works in real life. Dr. Ola, you started your journey in fundraising locally before fundraising for an offshore structure. What informed that strategy, and what are some of the benefits that you have seen in proceeding in that fashion?
So I think the main benefit of raising locally in your home sort of country, or where you have great networks, is it reduces the time to raise your fund if it's a small fund. So raising from friends, colleagues is faster, and you can start building that track record a lot earlier. So going around to people that you've worked with, going around to high net worth individuals in your locality, is probably like they already know, like, and trust you. So the due diligence is shorter and you can get to investing. Obviously, if you don't have friends, that's a different issue. But if you do have friends that sort of can pull together funds, then, you know, I raised my first funds in a few months. So we were operational. And that's different from when you're raising from institutions. And very, very different from when you're raising from strangers. So people that you've been introduced to, perhaps, that don't understand your background, that haven't worked with you before. Then that's like a long getting to know you period. And also travel costs as well. So for my for the first fund, I sort of didn't drive more than 20 minutes. For the institutional funds, I take 100 flights a year. So it's a very different sort of cost profile in terms of travel cost as well when you're raising from international investors, because the same way you got to know the local friends and colleagues is the same way that you're going to have to know the international investors, and they can be spread across continents. So I think, you know, raising locally from people that already know, like, and trust you, reduces the cost of fundraising and reduces the time it takes you to fundraise, and also helps you to start building that track record really quickly.
And building a track record is one of the main barriers that a lot of emerging managers have in attracting institutional investors. So quite important to keep in mind the other ways in which you could do that with local investors. Elena, in dealing particularly with first-time investors, what are some of the challenges and mismatches that they may have within their mandates and African fund realities? We mentioned that one of the homeworks that fund managers need to do is understanding their investor base. What do investors need to understand about African funds, and what are some of the solutions they need to, consider in addressing some of these challenges?
And thank you, Tobile. I'll sidetrack you for 1 second because
please go ahead.
Because I think what Ola was mentioning, I think is really interesting about the ability to raise from friends and family. And at the same time, I do want to recognize that for a lot of female fund managers, that's simply not so much of a possibility. If if we all know about the glass ceiling and having salaries that are not equivalent to the male counterparts, and so the ability to save the same amounts of capital as male counterparts that would be launching their first funds is not necessarily there. And then on the African continent, the access to the friends and family that would be able to support you in the launch of a first fund is not necessarily uniform, if I can put it that way. And so I think being able to have structures like the warehousing facility that we're putting together tries to solve exactly this problem, which is how do we get more access to capital to people that don't necessarily have these types of networks and relationships, to still give them an equal opportunity to raise their funds and be able to put those funds on the market. And local capital, yes, can be a solution, but I think it really depends on the types of networks that you've been able to cultivate in the past. And so, just saying that there's different options, that you shouldn't, think that being a fund manager is not open to you if you don't have the friends and family option. There's other things that exist on the market and products that exist that can support you in launching your first fund. But to go back to your questions, indeed, there's, what we're seeing on the African continent right now is that there seems to be kind of a cold front, if I could put it that way, in terms of institutional investors shying away from wanting to support fund of funds and wanting to do more direct investments. And I think, this unfortunately is taking away from the expertise that some really great fund of funds have on the market. And there's really something about being able to encourage local fund of funds that have been present on the African continent for decades, that really understand the market, understand the types of fund managers that are required to do the type of work that is needed for African SMEs, for African startups, and the type of value addition that's required for these types of businesses. And so from that perspective, I think I would really like to encourage institutional capital to actually lean more on fund of funds structures and on the expertise of these fund managers that have done it themselves and really understand what it takes, and have what it takes as well to support emerging managers in their journey as they're launching their first funds and perhaps even going into a second structure. They're present in the market, they've done their homework. And so I think there's not only can you benefit from their expertise, but also it allows you to diversify your risk. If you're not familiar with that specific market, that fund manager is not going to be investing only in one market. They're going to be investing, typically throughout the continent. So there's really something about you being able actually to learn more about the African continent if you go through a fund of funds, and being able to understand, what different strategies are available. You have a bigger access to information as well that might allow you eventually to do different types of direct investments. So I guess from my perspective, I'd really like to encourage investors to lean in on local expertise that understands the market, as opposed to wanting to jump in and do direct investments themselves without necessarily being as experienced and present in those markets.
And I cannot agree with you enough on that point. I think around the question of investor comfort and protection, definitely fund of funds have a role to play. Understand that, investors want to go direct, but how practical is it if you want to support, emerging fund managers and access some of those opportunities within emerging fund managers' investment vehicles? On the topic of providing comfort and protection to investors, Ali, especially when it comes to investing on the continent, there is a conversation around perceived versus real risk. International investors typically need some level of heightened reassurance, especially regarding ability to exit investments and repatriate their funds. In this regard, are you able to share some examples of measures that are in place that will provide this level of comfort and protection to investors?
Sure, Tabile. So international investors are rightly focused on issues like exit flexibility, capital repatriation, and legal protection, especially when they are investing in emerging markets or African markets. One key consideration or one key factor which they look at is the country's legal and regulatory frameworks, whether they are following international standards and are they based on the common law system with the possibility of having recourse, let's say in case of disputes or litigations, to the ultimate court of appeal. Now, this gives investors confidence in the rule of law in the country and also to enforce certain contracts. Now, another important consideration, I would say, is the free movement of capital and profits. Now, we all know that there are a number of restrictions or foreign exchange controls in many African countries, and not necessarily Africa, but elsewhere. And this really bogs down some of the transactions, and it's quite painstaking when you have to go to the central banks and to seek approval to bring in money and to take money out of the jurisdiction. Mauritius, for example, does not impose exchange controls, and that is a big advantage to those investors who are worried about tight capital rules. Now, what I feel is the most important factor is the viability of investor protection mechanisms. Yeah. For example, in Mauritius, there are strict licensing requirements for those fund managers and funds, and the Financial Services Commission, the regulator, actually mandates full transparency through the offering documents, and there are regular reporting which enhances investors' confidence. Now, these vehicles which you set up are actually well regulated, and they ensure that they are following proper governance. They are reporting information adequately and in a timely manner. The other thing which I would like to add is, in case something goes wrong, then the regulator has investigatory and enforcement powers, while the investors, they can have recourse to dispute resolution mechanisms. All of these are quite important. At the end of the day, I think the jurisdiction where your fund is based should be sending a strong signal that it is a reputable financial center, and it has the tools, necessary tools and framework to give investors and fund managers a peace of mind.
Thank you for that, Ali. I think other ways to provide a level of comfort to investors and build the trust is through the due diligence, which can be quite rigorous, especially for emerging fund managers, because if unprepared, this can delay the investment allocation and process and just perception an investor has on fund managers. Dr. Ola, in your experience, what has helped you in preparation for investor readiness?
So I think one of the keys to investor readiness for a lot of fund managers has been like estimating when to sort of quit their day job. So the biggest sort of reason that I've seen like fund raises fail is because people just need to go back to their jobs. A lot of people, I know a fund manager in America, for instance, who said, you know what, I'm going to sell my house, I'm going to raise my funds, and then I'll start deploying in 18 months. But 18 months down the line, she hadn't raised her funds. And now she had no house and no funds. So she had to go back to her work, day-to-day work. So it's really about estimating your runway and being realistic about the fundraising environment and saying, you know, how long is it going to take me to raise? And how do I balance that with my regular source of income? And trying to have as much done as possible before sort of relinquishing that regular source of income, because then it becomes like a runway game in terms of, you know, how soon are your savings going to run out? And for a lot of people, they run out sooner than they probably estimated. So in terms of investor readiness, I guess what has helped me the most is having a really solid track record from that small pilot fund. So we were able to make 6 investments from that fund. 2 of them became some of the biggest companies ever out of Africa. So we're able to return money to our investors. We invested in a company called Paystack right at the beginning of our sort of fund life. And 4 years later, we invested at a valuation of about $1 million. That company sold to Stripe for $200 million. We also had some secondary exits. So we're able to become, actually, we did a 5x DPI on that first fund, which even by American standards would be a top quartile performance. So when you asked about investors being scared of Africa, I can't think of in America, they call them bagels because it's like a bagel looks like a zero, a bagel fund, when a fund returns 0. In the venture capital ecosystem in Africa, I can't think of a single fund today that has become a bagel fund. It's just easier. Africa is one of the most efficient venture capital ecosystems in the world, if not the most efficient. I can't think of a single fund that hasn't returned capital. In America, there are plenty of funds that return 0. There are plenty of bagels. But it just in Africa, because the venture capital per capita is so low, it's when you do the calculations, and I can share my business case for Africa article in the chat. When we did the calculations, we looked at Asia, we looked at Europe, we looked at America, and found like $1 in Africa is more likely to find a unicorn than in any other region of the world. So this risk perception is something that I think the African fund managers need to come together to kind of myth bust, because actually, you know, we've been getting good returns both on secondary markets, on strategic acquisition. The only thing that I think is we don't have the same track record as America for is IPO. But even when you look at America, only 20% of exits occur by IPO anyway, so 80% are via strategic acquisition. So there's that sort of ratio, even in the American market, that has the most successful stock market in the world. So back to your original question about investor readiness. It's about having your data room in order. It's about having preliminary conversations with potential anchors. It's about having developed relationships. The best time to build your relationships is before you need them. So having pre-developed relationships with your target funders or LPs, be that family offices, high net worths, or development finance institutions or pension funds. So being able to almost not predict, but being able to have had some initial conversations with them to understand what they're investing in, where they are in the cycle, how much money they have approved, what other funds are in the market, who likes your thesis and who doesn't, before sort of relinquishing that sort of stable source of income.
Amazing. I'm blown away by some of those stats. Even myself, I did not know as an African. So a lot of conversations need to be happening, I think, around the realities of African investments and the opportunities and what investors can get out of that. Thank you so much, Dr. Ola, for those statistics. I'm just reading some of the questions in the chat, and I see, Elena, you've started responding to them, but I think some of them, you know, warrant being spoken about to the broader audience, particularly the one around the typical timeline for first-time African fund managers to close their fund based on your experience.
Yeah, and hearing Ola speak, I think it allows you to understand why the timeline is so long. I mean, what we're seeing is that for a first-time fund manager, male or female, on the African continent, it takes about 36 months to be able to raise. And then even for subsequent funds, depending, whether you're in the VC space, the PE space, and the type of kind of investor profile that you're targeting, it takes 24 to 36 months to raise subsequent funds. So it is a tough journey there, which is why having the adequate free capital and working capital to fund your operations as you're raising is really, really important. And all the considerations that Ola mentioned are incredibly important, in making sure that you are indeed prepared for the journey and the time it's actually going to take around the raise. And especially, if you're targeting institutional capital, from our experience, from the first conversation that you have with them, even as a more experienced manager, to the moment where they are actually signing your documents, it can easily take 24 months. And the more, the institutional capital, when we're talking about DFIs specifically, they have very specific processes that you have to go through. And they have dedicated teams that are going to look at governance and compliance and impact and investment strategy. And these teams work on, specific timelines. And the legal teams as well are going to work on specific timelines. I have yet to see a DFI be able to join a fund, in terms of legal negotiations that take less than 6 months. If somebody has been able to do that, I'd love to meet them. But there's definitely something to be said about, working with bigger institutions that have their own internal processes. So you really must factor that in if you are targeting institutional capital. It does take a lot of time in order for you to be able to actually get access to that money and start making investments, which is why, it's great to hear about the different structures. Are you able to build an SPV? Can you start making investments right away? Do you have friends and family, that are able to support you? So you're already not only building your track record, but possibly getting some of these investments going that you'll be able to then convert into your own fund, and have participate into the performance of your own fund in the future. So you don't feel like you're just fundraising, but at least you're also moving forward with your investment strategy as you're fundraising.
Amazing. Ali, on your side and in your experience, what are the timelines that you've seen, in assisting some of the emerging fund managers set up, their investment vehicles? And perhaps as a lasting point, what are some of the practical key takeaways that fund managers and investors must always remember?
Thanks, Tobile. Well, over the past 2 decades, I've been working with fund managers and other types of investors in different geographies in Asia, Southeast Asia, the US, EU. I've seen a number of scenarios. Some have been great success stories, but some of them did really struggle. And Elena, she's covered a couple of them. Fundraising is not easy. If someone tells you this, then that person needs to get out of the bubble. It is a very difficult exercise. And once let's say you've identified a DFI who is interested to invest in your structure, like she said, Elena, it's a tough exercise. It's a journey to be able to, let's say, pass the due diligence and get all the paperwork completed. Now, when we look at setting up the fund structure itself, in the age we are living, where there is a constant scrutiny on compliance is actually key. I think we should not be looking at anything below 3 to 6 months for establishing a fund, because, like I said, compared to a small special purpose vehicle, a fund is quite robust. It's like the G-Wagon. You need the infrastructure and the framework in place. And to get all of these in order, you have to work with your tax advisor, you have to work with your counsels, you have to work with the fund managers, you have to work with your bank. So all of these do take time, and it is a tedious exercise. You don't want to go to the regulator, you submit your application, and then there are a lot of back and forth in relation to your documents or your risk management framework or your other architectures and infrastructures. Now, if you've read the book, which is called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the habits actually is to begin with the end in mind. So very often I have come across fund managers where they already know the end, and what they do is they establish a roadmap with different milestones. And then it gets very interesting because they've broken down what they want to do in terms of pursuing the journey. Are they going to fundraise to specific investors within the first year, and then eventually they will admit another round of investors? So it is important to have that roadmap in place so that you understand how you are going to proceed. And the roadmap is not sufficient. It brings me back to the initial question you've asked me. You have to do your homework. Where would you like to set up your structure? Is it going to be in Mauritius for your Africa focused fund, or is it going to be in other jurisdictions which are there on that list? Then what are the different factors you should be looking at? Like I said, your professional infrastructure. And also what is important is to understand whether you have the support of the banks, because very often people tend to neglect the bank roles in all of these fund structures. So it is important to be asking questions whether the bank you're working on can actually help you to channel your investments. Sometimes you do need some sort of structured finance, a bridge loan facility, or other kind of solutions which could be important for you to grow your portfolio. So all of these factors have to be taken into account. I don't think you should be alone in that. You need your support system, and by support system I mean your fiduciary agent or your fund administrator, your tax advisor, and your legal advisor to help you in defining that journey.
Amazing. In my own personal experience, I can vouch for how difficult and humbling fundraising is. Dr. Ola, if there was one piece of advice you wish someone would have told you right at the beginning of your journey, what would have that been as a lasting comment from you?
I think that you need to act as if you're running for president. Speak to everybody. Well, so when you see somebody that's running for president, they go to every jurisdiction, they go to every state, they kiss every baby. When they're with the fire people and they're trying to get the fireman's vote, they dress up as a fireman. When they're going to the hospital and they want to get the nurse's vote, they dress up as a nurse. When they want to get the school teacher's vote, they dress up as a school teacher. So I think, rather than really just focusing on, I need to get this particular investor, I need to get this particular investor, have a wide range of strategies for different investors, tailor your approach to different investors, understand that impact investors will have a different sort of lens to look at your funds compared to foundations. And obviously the best time to build your network is before you need it. The best time to keep that network strong is always.
Sure. Having a wide range of strategies. Elena, are there any success stories that you can share, and some lasting comments on the strategies that you've seen which have worked with the managers that have been part of your cohort?
Well, so if I can, preach to the choir maybe here, but I'm sure Dr. Ola will agree with me. What we have seen actually is that female-led fund managers and balanced fund managers, typically when they finance companies, there is a revenue increase that is experienced by their portfolio companies that is higher than male-led only fund managers. So I just want to say that there is an opportunity to go beyond just investing in male-led fund managers, which unfortunately still represents 90% of all the PE and VC capital in the world. So I'm digressing again, but I had to make the statement because I think it really is a business opportunity actually to invest in female fund managers, and especially female fund managers on the African continent. In terms of the fundraising game, I think I absolutely agree with what has been said. It's a game of snakes and ladders. I have no other I have no other expression for it. You really you don't know when you're going to roll the dice and hit on a ladder and be able to move up. But one thing I can say is that if you are prepared, and indeed, as Tobile was mentioning earlier, having your data room ready, having all of the information that is required there, having your investment strategy, having worked through your fund model and being able to speak to it and the rationale of the fund model, having been able to speak to what value add you're actually bringing, what distinguishes you from all of the other fund managers that these investors are meeting on the ground. I think then in that case, you'll be able to answer questions of investors very quickly and reassure them, and hopefully reduce that 36 months to, who knows, an 18 months. And in terms of success stories, what we've seen is that fund managers that are prepared, they're the ones that are able to seize the opportunity when it comes to them. And we've seen people like Adesua from Arua Capital that is investing with a gender lens. She started her first fund as a smaller fund. It took her actually 7 years from the moment where she conceived the fund and her first child, as she likes to say. And it took her 7 years from that moment in order to be able to raise. But now in the second fund, she's been able to raise it before even having closed or finished the investment period on her first fund. So her second fund journey has been significantly shorter because of the track record she was able to demonstrate. But that first fund was actually painstaking, and she's someone that has a background in M&A and has networks throughout the world and has very strong networks, and it was still difficult, and she was very creative about the way that she did it. So she refused to just essentially be targeting DFIs. She went to a lot of high net worth individuals, asked for smaller amounts of money, and was able to build a small first fund out of that, which now allows her to build a bigger fund with still a gender lens investing strategy, investing across Nigeria and Ghana. And so, I think the idea is that you have to accept to be flexible, and you have to be creative in the way that you raise capital. It won't always look like what you want it to look. I think a lot of fund managers want to raise their first fund as an $100 million fund with DFIs, being able to seal the deal within a year. I don't think the market works that way. I think you need to be open to different structures. Ali has spoken to the different structures that can exist and can allow you to grow towards a fund manager that has, a bigger fund in the future. And I think it's worth exploring those to make sure that you're able to raise and prove your track record, and eventually be able to have the type of assets under management that you really are aiming for.
Thank you so much for that, Ilana. So I think the key takeaways here is, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. You need to start with the end goal in mind. You need to not give up no matter what. Be clear on your strategy. And also, I think being flexible and creative is another key takeaway. And I would like to thank you all so much for being part of this very meaningful and insightful discussion. I think it'll be a loss if we do not share, where people can reach you and access some of this information that you have shared. Ali?
Can you say that again, please?
If you could just share where people can reach you, and or if there's resources where they can access these resources with all the information that you've shared.
All right. Well, most of the information I have shared are actually public information, but some of the discussions or specific points I have raised are based on my personal experience with fund managers. So what we could do is, after this webinar, we'll share the link, and we'll put the details of the panelists there. They can reach out to me or reach out to anyone at Standard Bank. We are present on LinkedIn, and we will direct you to the right person. Or if you're speaking directly to me, you connect with me on LinkedIn. I will be happy to share my experience and some of the success stories I have seen, but also the challenging ones. And there are many lessons learned from these fund managers. But yeah, we'll share the details on LinkedIn.
Thank you. You can also drop, and I see, Alana, you've done it already. Drop a link in the chat for everyone, Ali. Thank you, Alana. You've shared the 2xignite.org as a link where people can reach you. Dr. Ola, are you part of any networks? I don't want you to be giving your personal contact details, but are you part of any networks that people, fund managers can join? How can they, learn from your experiences?
I have almost 1 million followers on LinkedIn already. I post every day about venture capital and private equity. So if you want to follow, you'll probably learn a lot about venture capital. On my YouTube, I have a venture capital course that teaches about putting together your fund thesis, how to build your fund model, how to do portfolio management and legal negotiations. Unfortunately, I got a bit carried away, so it's now like a 10-hour course. But if you go to Dr. Ola Brown on YouTube, I've kind of divided it up into 20-minute segments. So if you're a fund manager looking to put together fund thesis, deal sourcing, how to do valuations, how to do your fund model, then it's all on my YouTube. But LinkedIn is the easiest way to reach me. And if you just follow passively, within a few weeks, you'll probably learn a lot about VCMP if you want, if that's sort of your interest. I also publish a lot of reports. We have 2 reports out now. One I've already posted in the comments, which is the business case for Africa, which has all the calculations for venture capital efficiency in Africa. We also have a healthcare unicorns report out that focuses on health tech.
Thank you so much for that. And we will also certainly share on our own platforms. The African Women Impact Fund and MiDA Advisors will be sharing these details on our own LinkedIn platforms. And that brings us to the end of today's session. And again, thank you so much to the panelists for their time and valuable insights. Now, in order to fundraise successfully, fund managers need to offer products that can address a range of investor needs, including track record, good governance, risk management, and transparency. And I hope today's session was able to showcase some of the strategies available to both investors and emerging fund managers for building lasting trust and making investments onto the continent. Thank you so much for joining today. Until the next session, have a lovely day further.